Good morning, family of fast. Matt Mosman, the Chief Endurance Officer over at EndurElite. Today, we're gonna talk about the bad C word, which is cortisol. Now, if you're like a lot of people, you have been led to believe that cortisol in the body is a very, very bad thing. I'm here to tell you that it's not as bad as you think in most situations. Now, at this point, you may be saying, "Jumping Jehoshaphat's, Matt, cortisol is really not that bad." For the most part, it is not bad unless it's chronically elevated. So today what we're going to talk about is the critical roles that cortisol plays in the body. We're going to talk about what raises cortisol levels, and then what can happen if cortisol levels are chronically elevated, and what kind of negative consequences that can have. So, simply put, cortisol is the body's main stress hormone produced by the adrenal glands. Now, it plays a ton of different functions in the body. It helps regulate how carbs, protein, and fats are used. It helps control blood sugar. It helps reduce inflammation, which might come as a surprise for you. It assists with memory formation, regulates blood pressure, and then it also plays a part in your sleep-wake cycle. So in the morning, cortisol levels start to raise a little bit and say, "Hey, yo, wake your ass up." So those are some of the natural functions of cortisol in the body that are absolutely critical to your health. Now let's look at cortisol during exercise real briefly and see if that's a cause for concern. So as you exercise, once you get about to that hour to an hour and a half point, cortisol levels start to rise, and then when you finish, cortisol levels won't remain, elevated for too long before they go back to baseline. So the natural rise in cortisol during exercise, it's not a big deal because they do go back down to baseline afterwards. Now, there's a situation where that won't be the case, which we'll get to here in a second. So, let's talk about what can chronically elevate cortisol levels and the negative consequences that can have. So, culprit number one of chronically elevated cortisol levels are tearing your hair out kind of stress from all these work deadlines. Two is lack of sleep from things like your 3-year-old waking you up in the middle of the night telling you that they're hungry, which I don't know what that's all about. That never, ever happens to me. And then a third culprit of elevated cortisol levels is overtraining, overreaching, and not getting enough recovery. So in these situations, cortisol levels, if they will become chronically elevated if stress is constant, if you're chronically sleep deprived, and as an endurance athlete, we're all a little OCD and we all have a tendency to overdo it. So in those situations, cortisol levels can remain chronically elevated. And this is where it gets a little bit bad, or here's what the negative consequences are of chronically elevated cortisol levels. Probably the biggest one is you just cannot feel like you can recover at all. You wake up in the morning, your muscles are sore, you have a general sense of malaise, and you're just not motivated to go out the door because your body is just hurting for certain. A lot of people will experience unexpected weight gain, depression, problems with memory formation, obviously trouble sleeping, and headaches are all kinds of symptoms of chronically elevated cortisol levels. Now, what can you do to basically stop chronically elevated cortisol levels? Kind of trying to minimize cortisol levels, the increases after exercise, not necessarily chronically, but acutely. You want to eat protein and carbohydrates immediately after exercise, and this will help minimize the cortisol response. But back to the chronically elevated cortisol levels, it sounds really stupid and simple, but get sleep, try to minimize your stress, so things like meditation, going out for a walk, finding a good way to distress is absolutely key. And then taking your recovery days. If you have a hard workout, take at least one recovery day, if not more, to let your body recuperate. I always say the best judge of, if you're recovered is not by heart rate or all these other fancy methods, is just by how you feel. I think that's the simplest way to kind of gauge, if you're recovered or not. And then there are some supplements that may help with cortisol levels too. Off the top of my head, probably the best one is ashwagandha, which is an adaptogen, which means it helps minimize the stress, the physical and mental stress of certain things like exercise. If you want to try ashwagandha, the recommended dose is about 6,000 milligrams a day, split up into 3 2,000 milligram doses. So check out ashwagandha. I think it's a pretty beneficial supplement. Lots of good research behind it as far as reducing cortisol levels and kind of reducing the overall mental and physical stress of exercise and other life situations like a stressful job or pain in the ass kids or things like that. So that is the down and dirty on cortisol. The main point being is cortisol really isn't that bad when it's produced naturally in the body to do all these different functions. What cortisol really comes in and has negative consequences is if it remains chronically elevated. So you want to find a way to get lots of sleep, de-stress, and get good recovery days. So that is in a nutshell how to prevent, chronically elevated cortisol levels. So if you have a friend who has experienced some of these negative effects of chronically elevated cortisol levels, please share this video with them. If you want other videos like this on endurance training, nutrition, and supplementation, subscribe to the EndurElite YouTube channel or head on over to the EndurElite blog at www.endurelite.com. Get social with us on Instagram and the EndurElite Training and Nutrition Club Facebook page. And until next time, my endurance friends, stay fueled, stay focused, and stay fast.